From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Labour's annual conference is underway, and with it, Labour's annual identity crisis. Last year's landslide election victory is now a distant memory, and it's policy rows and leadership gripes that everyone's talking about now. Today, we've three different Labour pains to examine with three Times specialists. Political drama.
Starmer started out playing number 10 politics on easy mode, but through a series of unforced errors, it has been far more difficult than anybody could have imagined.
A stagnant economy.
So the big growth miracle that they've been banking on, the growth lever, turns out there isn't really a lever.
And growing illegal migration.
For almost all of 2025, the number of small base arrivals was greater than the previous peak.
The story today, the three big problems facing Labour. Right, can we start? Can you introduce yourselves? Go on.
My name's Gabriel Pogrund. I am the Whitehall editor at the Sunday Times.
And soon to be Times Politics podcaster. Will it be any good?
Hell yeah, it's going to be amazing. Honestly, it's going to be great.
Tell us about, well, the last 14 months behind that famous number 10 door and how much upheaval, personnel stress, and maybe like a whiff of scandal as well there has been.
It's been the most extraordinary and precipitous descent in popularity of any government in recent times, probably ever. I mean, it's sort of a well-established truth that the government had a very broad, if shallow, majority. But it also had advantages that other prime ministers would have only dreamed of. The gravity-defying scale of that parliamentary majority, the degree of contempt and anger among the population towards their predecessors. So Starmer started out playing number 10 politics on easy mode, but through a series of unforced errors and through a few events which nobody, not even Angela Rayner's stamp duty advisors, could have foreseen, it has been far more difficult for Keir Starmer and co than anybody could have imagined.
Well, you mentioned Angela Rayner there. Let's talk about departures, first of all. There have been, several ministers, several comms teams. I mean, what are the sort of departures that you think have hit deepest? So
let me begin with a concession to our listeners. I understand that people are less interested in the internal departures than they are the ministers they've heard of. So let's start at the top table. Obviously, we've recently had the departure of Angela Rayner.
The UK's Deputy Prime Minister is forced to resign. Angela Rayner, who also served as the Housing Secretary, referring herself to the Independent Ethics Advisor after admitting to not paying enough stamp duty tax.
Peter Mandelson, the ambassador, fell on his sword owing to the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. You had Rishnara Ali, homelessness minister, resigning because of her defenestration of some of her own tenants. You had Tulip Siddiq resigning as anti-corruption minister because of her involvement in a corrupt government. I went to Bangladesh to report on that, which was quite an experience.
And she is still denying any involvement in that government or what happened, the government of her and Sheikh Hasina.
Let's be fair to her. She says that she was never involved in the corrupt practices of the Sheikh Hasina regime.
But lost her job.
You had Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary, resigning.
The list is longer than I thought.
It's a long list, and that's only outward facing. Internally, you've had the departure of Sue Gray.
From top civil servant to Partygate investigator to Keir Starmer's top aide. But just 3 months in, Sue Gray has quit. Weeks of private power struggles and public criticism have ended in her departure.
You had a scandal which my colleague Patrick Maguire and I broke on Lord Ali, which was another sort of turbulent moment for the internal operation. And now you've got the Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, under a lot of pressure owing to his historical failure to declare around £750,000 in funds that went to a campaign group that he ran, Labour Together, which played a key role in Starmer's leadership campaign victory back in 2020. So, scandals are only one prism through which one can view a government. But if you are to view it through that prism, it's been a lot busier for a government which was elected on the basis that it would clean up politics and return Downing Street to, probity and order than expected.
So Morgan McSweeney, the Chief of Staff, is under pressure, and he, in your reporting and others, is someone who is credited with actually getting Starmer ready to be Prime Minister. But then we've also got all of these comms people who have been and gone in the last 14 months. We had Matthew Doyle, former Downing Street head of comms. We had James Lyons, of course, who left not too long ago as well. We've had only recently Steph Driver, one of his heads of communications, leaving. Is that quite difficult for Starmer, that there are all these people who are there to try and help shape his message, a message which is clearly not getting across and landing, and they're quitting?
Musical chairs in Downing Street are nothing new. And I think that the reason why this is interesting is that it aligns with the general mood in Downing Street and the general critique of Starmer's government, which is that he lacks a political identity. And when you lack a core story, then communicating to the public becomes difficult. And the fact that there have been all these directors of communications who have departed, it's difficult to escape the fact that if the government was telling the coherent story, perhaps those departures would have been less likely.
Isn't the issue as well that it's filtering down to policy as well? It's not just about the messaging. I mean, what have we had in terms of U-turns or policies junked recently?
So the key U-turns have been on winter fuel payments.
More pensioners are to receive winter fuel payments. The decision to limit the winter fuel payment to only those who claim pension credit was one of Labour's first acts in government.
On reforms to the benefit system.
The original plan was to limit who receives some benefits and cut others to save £5 billion.
And less in policy terms, more in political terms, the reversal in Starmer's position on a grooming gangs inquiry. Welfare in particular and winter fuel, those are examples of how the majority doesn't mean anything if the people who have to troop through the division lobbies for you aren't signed up to the idea. And that matters both in Westminster in terms of one's political authority, but also in terms of the market's conviction and your ability to carry out your own agenda. There's definitely a world where the government can condemn this torrid period to the past, but it will hinge partially on this conference speech, because it's not the only moment, but one of the moments where you can talk to the country and your party. But really the budget is going to be the moment where the rubber hits the road, and that is kind of the big essay question the government's facing now.
So we've got the conference, the Labour conference, and Starmer's big speech as part of it. How big a moment do you think this is for Starmer of peril or renewal?
Conference is one of those moments where the potential for political reward is high and the potential for political damage is even greater, because when you're doing it hot on the heels of a difficult period politically, there's this sort of general sense that anything you do that's awkward will be portrayed as a metaphor for the wider troubles facing the government. So whether it was the letters falling off the back of Theresa May's conference stage, or this is not a party conference event, but Rachel Reeves's tears in the House of Commons, anything in terms of body language, in terms of delivery, in terms of verbal gaffes that is sort of subsumed within a wider narrative becomes dangerous. But also the potential reward is that Starmer can draw a line under the last while and he can attempt to reframe the government's next phase. And also announce some policies. There's nothing like actual real-world interventions that move the conversation on from the conduct of government. So there's plenty in it for Starmer and also his adversaries.
Fabulous. Gabriel, thank you. What's your name? Where'd you come from?
My name is Mehreen Khan. I'm the economics editor at The Times.
I feel like I ask you this every other fortnight. What state is the economy in, Mehreen?
Do I answer it the same way every time?
With varying degrees of magnitude.
Honestly, the economy is just bubbling along pretty much fine. There's no big disasters. We're not going through a recession. We're not having an economic boom. The economy is growing at a range of about 1 to 1.5% a year, which is basically where we have been stuck in the post-pandemic era. But the idea that this government has done anything to particularly lift growth, so the big growth miracle that they've been banking on, the growth lever, turns out there isn't really a lever. And you can say, as we get to conference a year in, the government is still scratching its head about how to get this growth number up, because the obvious things to do, like lowering interest rates, can't happen because we have high inflation.
Let's talk about exactly that, because you said a while ago on the podcast that was the thing that could be the undoing of Rachel Reeves in the medium term. Obviously, the headline rate is getting higher and is currently...
It's 3.8% and it's probably going to be 4% in a couple of weeks.
But then food is even more so.
Yes. So the reason that I said that it's going to be the undoing is not because inflation generally, but the nature of the inflation. And the nature of the inflation is things like food prices and utility bills. And those are the things that people just feel. Like, if you had to say to me, what do people think about when they think of the cost of living? It's often what they're spending on their groceries and what's going out every month in their direct debit to pay for bills.
I'm yet to not wince buying butter.
Exactly. Butter, beef, coffee. These are all things that, like commodities prices, that are really not in the government's control, but they are really important, pertinent measures of how people feel about, how far their money goes.
Not in the government's control, but partly the fault of government. Didn't Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, point the finger quite strongly in his last update?
That's actually a good issue. So how much of what we are experiencing in terms of inflation can you blame on the government? So the things that I've said about global commodities prices, like, in the US, they've had an eggs crisis for a couple of months. And the fact that food prices are going up is something that nobody really foresaw globally. So yeah, it's just one of those things that happens, bad weather, harvest, etc. But there is a policy-related element, which is wages. So we lifted the national living wage in this country in April, which was a government decision, and we increased the tax that people pay, national insurance tax that employers pay to hire people, and we moved it so they have to pay more to hire lower paid workers. Now, in this country, if you work in retail, you're probably going to be earning national living wage, and you're probably going to be on the lower end of the income spectrum, which means it's more expensive to hire you. And a lot of the costs that they are now having to face, payroll increases, are being pushed down to prices.
Because to be fair, supermarkets run on quite sort of
very
thin
tight
margins.
Exactly.
So if all of a sudden it gets a lot more expensive to hire the same amount of staff to do the same thing, it's going to go somewhere.
They will pass it on to your prices.
Yeah.
And that's on top of the other double whammy of also having to deal with supply chain issues and the cost of commodities going up. So a 4% inflation rate, just to put it into context, is double the Bank of England's target rate. And we haven't had 4% for a couple of years. And even if you discount the terrible things that happened in 2022 and we were really at like a 10%, 11% rate, 4% is still very high. And it's not because prices are increasing at 4%, they are, but it's because the level of those prices is already high. So your oat milk was already £2.50 and now it's going to be £2.75. It never went back down to 2%. So the level of the prices is what people really feel, because they still remember what prices were like in 2021 or 2020.
I remember we used to be able to get a Pret egg and cress sandwich for £1.99.
What is it now?
Oh, guys, it's far north of that.
Really?
It's like £2 something. No, £3. Ignore that. We'll cut this out.
But those are exactly the kind of price memories that really make people feel like, oh, we thought it was going to get better. Nothing's getting better.
What can Rachel Reeves do then? We'll hear from her at conference. She's got a budget at the end of November. Autumn budget, they're still calling it.
It's one of the latest autumn budgets we've ever had, November the 26th.
What should she do?
What should she do? What can she do? What she needs to do is she needs to meet her fiscal rules. She's just said it's a non-negotiable thing that she has to be within these couple of targets that she set herself. And in order to do that, we think she needs to find around 20 to 30 billion pounds from somewhere. Now, how do you find that money? One, you could raise taxes. And that is the most active conversation happening around the Treasury and in government ministries and in the Prime Minister's new sort of economics department that he set up about which taxes should go up. Should we invent new taxes? Should we reform things like council tax and stamp duty to get a bulk of that money? Then the other one is spending cuts. And we already know how difficult this is. We saw what happened with the U-turn on welfare payments, where to cut the fat, where to trim the public sector. After being a government which has promised to kind of alleviate so much pressure on the public services to do better when it comes to delivering public services, it's not going to be the NHS. We kind of know that. It's sort of ring-fenced and protected. So where's the pain going to fall in other areas? There's not that much she can do because we had a spending review, so she kind of already laid out what government spending is going to look like. And then the other one is just kind of hope and pray for a growth miracle. So much of that number...
That's the options we've got to now.
Honestly, it's based on this very inexact science of forecasting. And so the amount of billions of pounds she needs to find is based on a calculation that a group of 3 or 4 economists do about what the state of the economy is going to look like in 10 years' time.
And these are always wide of the mark when we get to the point that they actually forecast.
The point is not they're supposed to be accurate. The point is they're supposed to add up. And so she's hoping that maybe there will be increase in growth going forward because of the trade deals that they've signed. The government is really keen to have the scoring of its planning measures and its infrastructure spending put into the OBR's forecast. That's all stuff we don't know how they're going to grade. What we do know is that there is a problem, and the problem is that one of the really important things the OBR looks at, which is productivity, that one they're going to downgrade. So their productivity estimates have been very, very over optimistic, and even small changes in this productivity estimate basically can wipe off tens of billions of pounds.
And if productivity is the sort of amount of economic value you can get out of a worker,
yeah.
Will AI not solve all of this?
It will make some professions very productive because it will replace a lot of labour to some degree. So people
all of a sudden you don't have to pay an economics editor to write all these columns.
That's the one.
The machines do it.
Look,
and then
when I talk about subjects, my own job is the one that I never speak about. But yes, some people already say I'm a chatbot, but I can be easily replaced by a chatbot. So the AI productivity potential is uncertain, unknown, could be huge, could be minor, will obviously affect some parts of the labour market more than other parts of the labour market. These are all things that are important and should be important for people like me to think about, and economists, but it's not really going to be a game changer for this budget. What the government will say, however, especially on that side of public spending, is that they're really, really banking on technology and digitisation to make the public services much more efficient. So to increase the part of the productivity part of the economy, which has been the worst, which is the public sector. So private sector productivity, it's not great, but it hasn't been terrible. In the NHS, it has fallen off a cliff since the pandemic. The NHS is really unproductive by its own standards. So you're going to hear a lot of this we will make your interactions with your doctors, your GPs, your ability to get surgical scans, diagnostics, all of this is going to be transformed by AI, and that's what's going to really be a game changer for the public services. So we'll hear a lot of that, but I'm not sure if it's going to be translated into the hard numbers on budget day.
I'm reliably informed that a free-range egg mayo sandwich from Pret is now £3.70 of His Majesty's sterling.
That's crazy. For some eggs and cress.
And a bit of bread.
Look, what salmon must be over £5? I don't even go.
Easy. Mehreen, thank you. Let's get going. So, what's your name? Where'd you come from?
My name is Aubrey Allegretti, and I'm the Chief Political Correspondent for The Times.
We are going to talk to you about illegal migration and asylum seekers, because that is another big issue which is plaguing this government at the moment. In terms of how things stand, how big an actual issue is it before we get into the politics?
Certainly. So illegal migration is still a very pertinent problem for this government. And it's something that they chastised the previous Conservative administration for. Small boat crossings having really started in 2018 and then exploded in terms of the size in 2022. And one of the reasons Labour's faced such difficulty is that actually for almost all of 2025, the number of small boat arrivals was greater than the previous peak in 2022. And Labour had overseen over 50,000 migrants who arrived by small boats during their first year in office, so from last July to this July. But just in 2025, this year, there have been 31,000 arrivals. So the scale of the problem is still significant. And I think ministers are finding it hard to rely on their mantra of trying to smash the gangs in order to convince people that actually they are in control, that they do have power and are able to effect this change on the scale required in order to reduce this problem.
And I guess the issue is twofold in that you've got not only people coming over in an irregular way, as they say, on small boats for the most part, but then also if they enter the asylum system, there's still quite a logjam there, and the question of how you house them or how you make sure that they can get to doctor's appointments and things. We had the case, didn't we, of that very, very expensive taxi that one asylum seeker was put in, paid for by the government.
Absolutely. There are so many sort of different elements to this issue. You have at the sort of front end, if you like, the number of people who are claiming asylum. Now, that actually rose to a record high in the year to June this year. And that was 111,000 people having claimed asylum in the UK, basically during Labour's first year in office. It was 14% more than the previous year and higher than the previous recorded peak of 103,000, which was actually back in 2002. So you have the number of people in the system, you have difficulties in terms of processing their applications, you have some difficulties in terms of removals or deportations. We heard that only 4% of small boat migrants have been returned since 2018. So there is an issue with returning people once they've been processed. There's an issue with stopping people coming here in the first place. And then you have all of the sort of wider societal and economic questions about crime, whether these people should be allowed to work, how well integrated they are in the local community and things like that.
The government might say, OK, we've had issues in the past, but we've had something of a reset and a rejig, and we're now on a proper path to sorting this out. What does that entail, and how much hope should we have that they are going to sort this problem out?
The government has made some steps that it certainly hopes will lead to a significant reduction. We've had the suspension of the family refugee reunion routes. We've had the one-in, one-out deal with France agreed and the first migrants removed. There have been 4 so far. And we have a new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, who we understand is much more open to working closely with the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, in order to reduce some of the barriers to deporting people. I think probably one of the most eye-catching announcements actually has come in the last few days from Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. He's announced plans for digital IDs. They're going to be introduced by the end of this Parliament, and that will mean that every worker is going to be required to have a digital ID in order to prove their credentials. The sort of link to immigration is that it's designed to avoid one of the pull factors for migrants who make the crossing on small boats being able to work much more easily in the black economy when they're not supposed to be able to work.
But with reform there, banging the drum about this, saying you need to go harder and faster in terms of clamping down on the number of asylum seekers and the amount of people migrating here. Is this, in policy terms, would you say one of the biggest issues for this government and a decider, if they're re-elected?
It certainly is a significant issue with lots of voters. Reform has been very effective in ratcheting this issue up the agenda over the summer. I spent almost every Monday going to Reform's weekly press conferences where they were proclaiming that Britain is broken.
It's about believing that our country is going down the tubes. It's about understanding that Britain is broken and that without the right leadership, without the right change of mentality, then I think most of us feel within a decade, it frankly won't be a place worth living in.
And announcing all sorts of quite radical ideas about mass deportations of illegal migrants.
The only way we will stop the boats is by detaining and deporting absolutely anyone that comes via that route.
And then more recently suggesting that actually even legal migrants who have indefinite leave to remain in the UK should be forced onto work visas, and the salary cap risen by more than a third, which would mean that lots of people would then end up living here illegally, even if they'd arrived legally and been living here legally. So the sort of pertinence of this issue is certainly very solid, and Keir Starmer is struggling, I think, to diffuse it.
And just finally, Aubrey, as we stare down the barrel of an exciting conference week in Liverpool, we've already heard, just on this episode about the economic woes facing Keir Starmer and his government, all the hokey-cokey of personnel they've had in Downing Street and in Cabinet and in the sort of great offices of state. And we've now got the Greater Manchester Mayor, Andy Burnham, on the prowl with this sort of pseudo-shadow leadership campaign.
It's got to be about more than a personality contest. The Tories were just constantly going through this at the latter end of the time that they were in government. It's got to be about a plan, a proper plan for the country and a proper plan to beat reform.
How shaky do things look for Starmer, would you say?
I think it's certainly true to say that MPs and ministers are nervous. They feel reform snapping at their heels. They look at the opinion polls and are deeply worried that Labour is so unpopular over a year into office. They're concerned about the local election results in May last year, very concerned about next year when Labour faces the prospect of potentially losing power in Wales, where it's been the biggest party for over a century, potentially not gaining that key foothold in Scotland and taking power in Holyrood that they would have liked. And then they're up for grabs in, I think, 48% of council seats across England. So there are lots of big electoral challenges that make Keir Starmer's path to staying as a sort of solid Prime Minister more difficult because the electoral landscape is so sort of tricky for him on the horizon. The one thing in his favour, I think, probably is just that the mechanism for removing him is near or non-existent. And so actually, I think a lot of these...
It's not the Conservative Party.
Exactly, yeah. The Conservatives had a very easy way of removing their prime ministers in a sense compared to the Labour leadership. And so actually I think the fundamentals don't change much. Keir Starmer is in political jeopardy, but that doesn't materially change his actual position.
Aubrey, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Aubrey Allegretti, Chief Political Correspondent at The Times, and before him we heard from Mehreen, who's Economics Editor at The Times, and Gabriel Pogrund, who is Whitehall Editor at The Sunday Times. And actually, if you want to hear more from Gabriel on this issue and much else besides, you can listen to the new Politics podcast he's part of, which launches this Wednesday and then is available every Wednesday. It's called The State of It, and it'll be available for free wherever you get your podcasts. That is it from us today. Today's producers were Micaela, Arneson and Olivia Case. The executive producer was Kate Lamble, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.